Okay?
Yeah,
Tell me when it's on.
it's on.
It's on. Okay, so I would like to talk a little bit about the early resistance against psychiatry, which quite a few of us were involved in back in the 70s, 1970s, starting in 1974, anyway, at the Second International Conference on Human Rights and Psychiatric Oppression, later changed its name to the International Conference for Human Rights and Against Psychiatric Oppression. So that was very important. And my first participation in the movement, which Judy Chamberlain, the late Judy Chamberlain, who's one of my heroes, called the Mental Patients Liberation Movement. That conference was held in Topeka, Kansas, and the year before, at the first conference, I understand, which I did not attend, in 1973 in Detroit, was so I was very thrilled to be able to participate and empowered, massively empowered by the brothers and sisters who were psychiatric survivors, activists speaking out and holding workshops and marching against local psychiatric institutions, which I would prefer to call psychiatric prisons, not mental health centers. So 1974 was my first year of activism in the movement in Topeka, Kansas. And that conference was organized by Sue and Dennis Budd, who lived in Lawrence, Kansas, pretty close to Topeka, and we were bunked in a campground. That's where we slept and so forth. We were not in any fancy hotel, I can tell you. We were in a campground where we camped outside, pretty much. And that conference in 1974 was very historic. We were marching, and a march at subsequent conferences was established in 1974, where we marched against and protested against Kansas State Hospital, which was locking up and forcibly drugging young children not even in their teens. That march and much of the organizing was led by a dissident social worker, and I forgot his name. I think it was Friedman or Friedlander. That's what it was. I don't know his first name. Friedlander. And it was a very exciting and empowering time. I don't recall if it was covered by the media, which generally has not been our friend or an ally. But since that time, I participated in 10, let me see, from 1974 to 1986, which was the last year that the conference was held, this time in Vermont. And we were openly greeted and welcomed by Bernie Sanders at that time.
Wow.
Sanders was mayor of Burlington. And he was the only politician, to our knowledge, that welcomed psychiatric survivors and specifically included the term psychiatric survivors, I believe, in his welcoming address. Certainly welcomed the movement, which was very, very extraordinary for a politician such as Sanders to do. I've never forgotten that. So Sanders was very, of course now he's a very prominent Democrat in the United States. Okay, so some of us were arrested during the protests, particularly against electroshock. We always had a workshop against electroshock at most of the conferences. And I remember back in 1983 was a very historic year where there was a lot going on in New York State. The psychiatrists got together, get this, to have a conference where they had live patients, where they demonstrated shock on live patients. Yes, at Gracie Square Hospital. Gracie Square Hospital, a private psycho prison. There were at least 9 of us who were locked, chained ourselves to the front doors of Gracie Square in protest against the against shock, and particularly against the live demonstration of the New York psychiatrists. Chained ourselves to the front door where the cops came and charged us with, I forget the exact charge. Anyway, they unchained us, and we were charged with trespassing, I believe, or mischief, or whatever the hell it was. And we were released the same day in New York, 1983. A few months later, now that was in New York City, in Manhattan, and then in not Schenectady. What was the other term where Zaz used to be? Oh, not Schenectady.
Not Syracuse?
Syracuse, thank you. So in Syracuse, the Benjamin Rush Psychiatric Hospital, which was shocking a lot of patients, electroshocking a lot of patients. So we chained ourselves to the front door again in protest. There was at least 9 of us again, and for many hours we were chained there. Once again we were arrested and released the same day. I don't think we got much media publicity except in the movement press. The corporate media generally couldn't care less, or they thought we were just troublemakers and we didn't have much. Anyway, and then in 1986, Judy Chamberlain and a few others were arrested for trying to, I think, hand out some anti-psychiatry information in Burlington, Vermont, where we were greeted by Mayor Bernie Sanders at the time. No, Judy Chamberlain was arrested, I know that, and I forgot the name of a few others. So the annual conference was an empowering, movement organized event that grew. It grew in numbers, so that, and I remember the one in 1982, going back a few years in Toronto, where we held, were on our own hosted as the local group, and Mel was involved in trying to arrange housing and meals and so forth. and the first women's statement, women psychiatric survivors, a historic statement came out, which was published in one of the women's issues in Phoenix. That was a key feature, as well as the principles of the movement, which was also published, which Leonard Frank and Judy and I think I was involved in helping to draft the principles of the movement in 1982, which is published in Phoenix in 1983, I think, when it came out with, in 1982, something, I can't remember the issue. It's been, since that time, I've been involved in a number of other protests, of course, mainly shock in Toronto. Since the Coalition Against Psychiatric Assault, or CAPA, was organized by Bonnie Burstow, who is on the faculty. She's a professor at OISE, Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at U of T, now in Toronto. She and I helped start the coalition, going back to 1980. Going back to, I'm trying to remember, I think it was 1983 in Toronto. The Ontario Coalition to Stop Electroshock. We started that, not just Bonnie, but a bunch of us psych survivors. Because Ontario was, the government of Ontario was authorizing and paying for a lot of shock treatment, which still goes on, which is one of the most destructive procedures in the history of psychiatry, which mainly targets women, nowadays, particularly elderly women, particularly. So it's both ableist and sexist in its procedure. That was very clear. It's been very clear for over 20, 25 years now. So in 1983, Bonnie Burstow and a bunch of others, a bunch of us, there were about 20 of us, including Hugh Tapping, who was a key figure in the organizing, held regular meetings to abolish electroshock in Ontario. The organizing meeting was held in Toronto City Hall, Council Chamber, which drew about 75 people. There was a panel of shock survivors only: Hugh Tapping, Carla McCabe, Sue Johnson, I forgot her first name, and I'm forgetting a couple more. Anyway, there was a panel of 5, and then there was the time where the people in the audience could ask questions. And I remember a man standing up in the audience, and after it was announced, mentioned by the panel of how strong the current was that was used in shocking people's brains. He says, if that amount of current was used in a construction site, it would be shut down. It would be shut down. We're talking about 150, 175 volts. Shut down. Today, over 300 volts are given against women, elderly women, and seniors in general. That much to overcome the resistance, to overcome the threshold of the drugs. That much is needed.
Can you explain that? What do you mean?
Yeah,
the threshold?
because the drugs, the psychiatric drugs which are given to calm people during, so to speak, to calm or to sedate people, so to speak, during the procedure, is now common practice to sort of knock you out before they deliver the electricity to the brain. So that raises the threshold in the brain and for a seizure to take place. A seizure has to take place, it does, during every shock treatment. An epileptic type of seizure, which the psychiatrists know about and refuse to acknowledge it. They call a seizure therapeutic. Since when is a seizure therapeutic? Neurologists would never call a seizure therapeutic, only the psychiatrists. So because the drugs which are given before the shock, just before the shock is administered, are used, it raises the threshold, the seizure threshold. So more juice, more electricity is needed to trigger the seizure. And I'm talking at least 250 to 300 volts, imagine. More than comes out of an electrical circuit that's used. I have been protesting with Bonnie Burstow and others, the Coalition Against Psychiatry, Psychiatric Assault, Coalition Against Psychiatric Assault, CAPA for short, has organized annual, yearly meetings, protests in Toronto, in front of the Parliament buildings and other places to stop this horrendous, brutal torture. And in 2013, my article, Electroshock, Torture as Treatment, that's the title, was published in in Madness, what's the title? I forgot the title of the book. It reads?
Mad Matters?
Mad Matters, thank you. A critical Canadian a book on that is critical, if not anti-psychiatry in many places, against psychiatry. So I'm very proud of that. And Bonnie Burstow has a chapter in her book against electroshock. So the media has stayed away. Lots of people don't know shock is going on. Even professionals who claim, even the intellectuals, among the social justice intellectuals claim, oh, really, is it going on? Is it increasing? Yes, it never stopped. Shock never stopped. A lot of intellectuals think that this is a resurgence. It never stopped. It just wasn't covered by the press. Shock has been going on. It's paid for, probably hundreds of dollars per treatment. I don't know the exact amount, but it's I'm sure it's well over 100, including what the anesthesiologist gets. So protests against shock have been very central in my protests. Because it always causes harm, it always causes brain damage, it always causes permanent memory loss. In my article, I can't get it. And I'm not going to get it. I have to turn it off. Wait a minute. Can you
Yeah.
stop this?
Yep.